and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Our guest this week is Jim Byrne, who has just developed a new online course to help us get to grips with the basics of modern monetary theory, MMT. Jim has been on the podcast before, so welcome back to the studio, Jim.
Very happy to be here. I'm a listener every week. As I was saying just before you come on there, I'm amazed at the amount of stuff that you managed to do. I don't know how you get up.
We're sometimes amazed as well, actually.
Yeah.
But.
So what gave you the idea to develop an online MMT course?
Well, as you know, I've been looking at the sort of modern monetary theory. I did economics and politics when I was in university way back in my mid-20s. So I've always been interested in politics. I've always been interested to a certain extent in economics. I must have came across modern monetary theory in some way, probably when I read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, that really kind of got me going, and I started learning about it. So I didn't necessarily understand the jargon. So I thought, you need a primer for this kind of course. You need something where you can actually understand it. So there must be quite a lot of people in the same position as myself. So the basic kind of idea is to do something which acts as a primer for further study for people that may be interested in economics, or maybe even they've heard of modern monetary theory and are a bit interested in it, but they don't have an economics background. So I think that this course provides that bridge between your economists and your techie economics people who really understand all the jargon, and folk who want to learn what is this modern monetary theory that they're all talking about, either disparaging it or saying it's the best thing since sliced bread. What is it? What is it? So I feel that I've tried to present it in a way that introduces it, but doesn't dilute the ideas. It does teach you all the jargon as it goes. So for instance, the second lecture, I think it is a document you can download, which is a dictionary of all the jargon that I've got on the course. So if you're thinking, I can't do this course because I don't know these, I don't even know what a deficit is, and then when you come across these words, you can look them up. So there's a jargon buster. There's all the kind of basic ideas about some countries issue their own currency, some countries use other countries' currency. So that it kind of goes from the beginnings of that kind of stuff. And it looks within that first introductory bit, I introduce bits of the kind of main areas, because I don't like people to think, well, this is just all introductory nonsense. Give me some of the meat. So I'm trying to give some of that up front. It's basically split into three: the why of MMT. Why do we need MMT? So I look at things like the planet heating up and the fact that nobody's taking responsibility for it. And as part of that, I've also got a wee history lesson, which is I take you from post-war, never had it so good generation up to the late 1970s when we went full belt into neoliberal economics. And then we've got like 300 people dying due to austerity. These are all the results. So that's sort of a historical journey that you think, okay, there's lots of reasons why we need a change. So that's the why. So it's why, what, how. So the second bit is what is MMT. So I then go into that, basically MMT, if I can sum it up, is a study of the monetary system so that they can understand the monetary system. That's basically it. So MMT looks at the details of how money is created, how it's spent, all the institutions it goes through, all the balance sheets that, it flows through, all that kind of stuff. And from that, you can say, well, if I understand the monetary system, I'm more likely to make policies that make sense. So if I understand how the mechanics work, then you've got a better chance of 300,000 people not dying because you've made a mistake of running an austerity policy, which really just causes the problems, and it doesn't solve the problem that they're trying to cause in the first place, which again, there's a bit of detail on that. So that's the sort of second section, what is it? And the third section is, how does it work? So that's more like, what can you do when you've learned all these things? And there's a thing in that section called functional finance, which is another bit of jargon. But it basically says that if you're in government, you should not be concentrating on things like, what's the level of the interest rates? What's the best inflation rate? What level of unemployment should be aiming? All these things that are targets. These are the last things you should be thinking about. You should be thinking, what do we need to do to make people's lives better? And how do we use the knowledge of the monetary system to make people's lives better? So it should be functional. But governments tend to spend their entire time thinking, oh, the debt level, my God, we're in trouble. Forget about the debt level. You don't need to worry about the debt level. You are a country that creates the money. There's no such thing as debt if you make your own money. So, you should be thinking about what is the best way of making sure that, for example, people are educated. I mean, I'm a big fan of lifelong education. Free lifelong education for everybody. That would be the best thing for the country. Imagine everybody had education to a high level and had it their whole life. Don't you think that would improve your economy? Don't you think that would improve all sorts of things? As a government, what else could be a good thing to do than that? Or aiming for a well-being economy? On the one hand, neoliberal economists would say, oh, we can't possibly afford that. MMT demonstrates that you can afford it. So functional finance, the how at the end of the course says, these are all the things we can do. And this is how we do it. Again, we'll look at the mechanics. And within that last part, actually, I talk about Scotland. I look at Scotland's economy and I look at something called sovereignty. And one of the things within that is I look at food sovereignty. So Scotland grows a lot of its own food. But the Scottish government doesn't have food sovereignty because it's controlled by big businesses. There's a very limited number of supermarket chains that control the whole system. So do we have control of that? No, we don't. So it looks at control as well as resources and funding and all that kind of stuff. So that's a summary of the course.
That's great.
That's really good. I mean, you very kindly gave us a link so we could have a look at it before we met today. I mean, I dipped into quite a lot of it. I can't say I did the whole thing, but I have picked out 3 bits that I particularly liked. Can we show those? Because that will give people a flavour of the kind of style of it. And quite often we dip in and out of YouTube tutorials and they've got a very particular style and it's very loud and flashy and everything. And I think the first thing that I spotted, this is a very different style. You've got a very laid back kind of chatty, here's what it's all about stuff. It took me by surprise at first, but I quite liked it as I got into it.
Maybe it's a Scottish style, is it?
I think it is. It's the Scottish style plus the array of hats. I think that's also kind of,
Well, fascinating. And then also you've got like an invisible friend who occasionally argues with you in the comments. And
yes.
That's right. That's right. I said, Jim, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
exactly. I'm thinking, So from that perspective, it's probably different to a lot of courses you'll ever have come across. So the first one that I'm going to start with, and I really like this because, as I say, we are not MMT experts. And this, I think, gave you some really basic concepts really quite well.
Because I'm really just introducing the topic, I've reduced it to what I think are the 3 best-selling ideas that set MMT apart from other approaches to the economy. First of all, MMT reveals the difference between currency issuing governments and currency using governments. Currency issuers can't run out of their own currency. The next best-selling idea is MMT points out that for currency issuing governments, all spending is new money. Neither taxes nor borrowing fund government spending. And the third best-selling idea, MMT tells us that the primary goal of fiscal policy, i.e. taxes and spending, should be to improve citizens' lives, firstly by achieving full employment and maintaining price stability. The focus should not be on balanced budgets, but on a balanced economy.
Even in those 3 statements, you would get orthodox economists going, what?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So far, as they've been set out, I thought, well, that's easy enough to understand. But for me, the question is so what if you do these things? What then? And you get onto that as well. The next bit that I thought was a really powerful bit in your course was when you talked about the planet being on fire. This one was really, really good.
Well, governments say that they cannot afford to make the required changes because they are constrained by fiscal rules and the need to balance their budgets. Now, this is something embedded within orthodox economics, and in particular neoliberal economics, is this idea that governments are just like households. You have to balance your budget. You can't spend what you've not got. And within neoliberal economics and within orthodox economics, there's this idea that the spending money is the money that comes in taxes. And if you don't get that money in, you cannot spend that money because you would then have to borrow. And then there's that old thing about your children in the future will then have to pay that back. So they're concerned with balancing their books. And as I say, it's still neoliberalism that dominates, and that's all about small government. And that's all about trusting the market to sort things out for the best of us all. Are they sorting things out? No. Half of Europe are unable to spend enough to meet climate targets under the proposed EU borrowing rules. These borrowing rules, by the way, are made-up rules. They are arbitrary rules. They're not based on any particular scientific research. But they're saying that they cannot meet their climate targets because they are not allowed to borrow enough money, to spend enough money to meet those targets. Assessment of countries' ability to meet different scenarios of increased spending at least 1, 2 or 3% of EU GDP compared to EU proposed fiscal rules. So they're telling us that the rules themselves are what's preventing them from reaching these goals.
Now, I thought that was an absolute showstopper because up until now, I've sort of thought, well, you've got orthodox economics, you've got MMT, they're just theories. But that is actually telling me that the planet is going to burn because we've made up reasons not to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in practice, it's absolutely correct. I mean, what we've got are economists advising governments about nefarious spending limits. In the UK, of course, they do actually still issue their own currency, and in America and Japan, China. Most countries in the EU don't, of course. No. They are particularly stuck in that, as I give the example there, that problem of the EU central bank making a rule which means that the EU countries can't meet their obligation to save the planet. It's just all ludicrous nonsense.
What are they going to do with all that money when it's been reduced to ashes? And we've got nowhere to live. I mean, it just is madness.
A good point. Well made. Yeah, I mean, people need to get their act together on this. I say the same thing as I've said in that maybe not as eloquently with a big map in front of me, but I try and say the same thing to people, and they just look at me and think, on the one hand, they don't believe that the planet's burning up. On the other hand, they don't believe what I'm saying about all these nonsense that the governments are implementing. They don't need to do it because basically there's something called a fiat currency, which is the government makes the money. No, you're not making it in your basement. I'm not making it in my basement. Banks are not creating new money. They're just giving loans, which have to be paid back. So the only thing within this scenario is that there are governments that issue the currency. They're the only ones, and they can issue as much as you like.
I thought this was quite a useful diagram from your course. This is is it over a period of about 300 years, the deficits?
Yeah, that's right.
And it shows to me that if you need to suddenly create a whole load of money for something, and I presume that must be one of the wars and perhaps both world wars.
No, one of them is the Napoleonic War. I think that must be the one back.
And the Napoleonic War, and then the first and second World Wars.
Yeah,
and we knew that with the banking crisis, with quantitative easing, and the pandemic. When they need to, they increase. Now, why are we not doing this to tackle global warming? It seems to me that's
a good question. Ask your MP.
Well, unfortunately, my MP is a lapdog laboured waste of time.
And my MP never replies to my emails. I can't understand why, because they're always very interesting. So during the COVID, so we got used to hearing about quantitative easing. So is that just a bit of jargon for the government's creating more money?
Strangely enough, this is another thing. Because MMT actually looks at all these things in detail, what things turn out not to be the case, what people think they are. Usually discover that that's not the case. because all that quantity easing is right. What it is they're buying back in theory bonds, in the secondary market. So the government's buying, and they're trying to put money into the economy. That's the kind of that's the conventional story. They're spending money out there, in return for these bonds. But actually, all they're doing is they're not actually raising any money. They're exchanging bonds for what are called reserves, which is like all the commercial banks have an account at the central bank, and the money kind of circulates within that. So that's the way they pay each other across the banks. So there's these reserve accounts, but they also buy and sell bonds within that, and all they are is kind of swaps. None of that money actually leaves there, right? The only thing that gets made are when you buy a bond, for instance, you're buying something which has got an interest rate, which is what you earn from it. That's the only thing that's earned. Nothing else. There's no money made either when the government sells bonds. There's no money made by the government. All they're doing is exchanging something. And if it's the other way around, there's no money that the government spends to get those bonds. That does not go into the economy.
So what about what happened after Second World War, where there was a Labour government voted in, and they started applying Keynesian ideas about let's do some really big infrastructure projects. My dad got a job after he came back from the army up creating the hydro schemes. So that's a different kind of thing, isn't it? Because you actually
that's government spending.
Okay.
Yeah, that's government spending.
Is it kind of with the same object to put money into the economy, although it actually did put money into the economy after?
Well, it's not the same object. The government buys and sells bonds in order to what they call change the overnight bank rate, which then affects interest rates. They're kind of managing interest rates. That's what they're doing when you do that. But government spending itself is always spent on something.
Yeah.
So they're making like a new bridge, or they're buying more tanks, or they're they're employing teachers, they're paying civil servants wages. So that is real spending, and that real spending does put money into the economy, which creates the old multiplier idea. People spend that money, and that so that does generate growth, and that's what happened after the Second World War. Is that the government decided to spend, if we looked at our graph, of course, we'll see that the deficits are maybe not as high as they were during the war, but you can see that they're high. There's a kind of weird thing about it, which is also that when you spend money into the economy, you get more tax back in to the government. So the deficit is not necessarily increased by spending to the same extent as you might think it is, because people are employed, people are sending tax into the government.
Yeah.
So there's all these variables and they only seem to be looking at the one and not considering all the other ones. So they get these strange beliefs which don't show up in the statistics. This is why MMT is kind of useful, because it looks at all the different things and how things are moving in practice.
Let me just come up to the third bit that I wanted to highlight from the course.
When a politician, or for that matter an economist, says there's no money left, they're lying. And even if they don't realise they're lying, because they don't actually understand how government spending works, they're still lying. The truth is, all spending restrictions are political choices, not financial ones. I would add one thing to this. Sometimes those political choices to restrict spending are the correct choices. For instance, if you did spend and it was going to cause inflation, then the correct thing perhaps to do in that instance is not to spend. Not all political choices are necessarily by default wrong. So what MMT is telling us is that all the issues in the world that can be fixed in some way just by spending money is that they can afford it, and the problem, if there are problems, are all about are the resources available to do the work. MMT tells us that these issues are political. They're not about not being able to afford to save the world. They're not about not being able to afford to have well-fed, employed citizens and not being able to look after your citizens' well-being. If you create the currency and there's resources out there to be used, you can use them. That's what MMT tells us. So the governments have the clout to sort these issues. I'll leave it at that.
You're talking about there has to be resources to do it. Because what I get really frustrated with is when you hear MMT aficionados, oh, currency creator, just create the money, that's all you have to do, and they walk away. And I'm thinking, no, I don't accept that that's all you have to do, and because otherwise everybody would be doing it. So as soon as you start explaining that, well, yeah, you can create money, but there have to be resources to spend it on, that starts to make it more within the bounds of something that I can accept as being logical. So just to help expand that a little bit, if we use the example of that we've just heard of the net zero and people saying they can't afford to fix it, what are the resources that an independent Scotland with a currency would need?
Well, I would take a step back and I would say that if you're going to spend money, you can create resources. So that's the first thing that gets ignored all the time, is this idea that somehow, oh, we can't employ more teachers because there are no teachers. Well, you can train teachers. We can't build the school because the resources, the bricklayers and the bricks are not available. We can train more bricklayers and you can dig up more bricks. If you've got the resources there to spend the money to do that, you can make resources by spending money as well as using that money to use those resources. So that's one of the things that tends to get forgotten, which I'd like to highlight. It's absolutely correct you say about the MMT. One of the problems with MMT is when you talk to somebody, you don't ever get past the first thing you say. Part of the story is always about the resources, but as soon as you say a currency issuing government can spend as much finance as they like, they're off on a journey and you'll never get a word back in again. You'll never be able to say the second half of the story is you need resources to buy and those resources can run out. But the thing is with the big story is if you understand these things, you can manage what you're doing. If you don't understand it, you can't manage it. MMT gives you a framework within which to work. If you look at China, everybody was astonished by the infrastructure, how everything, all the hugely brand new trains and, like they had solar panels roofing all the train tracks.
Yep.
I mean, it was just astonishing the amount of money they had spent on their infrastructure. And it turns out that Japan and China and places like that, I think Japan, in fact, have got the biggest deficit that anybody's ever thought in the world was possible. And all your Western economists don't understand why it's still standing because they think that deficits are dangerous. But these huge deficits, why have they got huge deficits? Because they're spending money on all these things and making things. So, China as an example, they wouldn't say they're doing MMT, but they're implicitly creating resources using their government spending.
By looking at through the MMT lens at what China's doing, you can understand why they're not bankrupt, is that?
Yeah, of course you can understand, because if you issue your own currency, what you're doing is you're putting a figure on the ledger, the government, oh yeah, okay, we've issued another £5 trillion, let's put that on the ledger. Do you have to pay that back? Where did it come from? Oh, we issued it ourselves. But we're not going to bother paying it back to ourselves. So, but where did it go when I issued it? Well, it went into the private sector, the non-government sector. Most of it went into the private sector. So if you want to cut the government debt, you're taking money out of your own pocket because you're taking that money back out of the private sector. So you've got to think, MMT also says government spending is one thing. You've got to always look, where did the money go? Yeah. Oh, right, I see where it went. It went into the private sector.
Right. This might be a good point to move on to some of the stuff we've been collecting from a couple of podcasts, because it's, I'd say, the cognitive dissonance between what we're discussing here, which again, I'm getting sucked into the logic of it, and then people who are supposedly experts on running the country. In this case, we've got, it's the News Agents is one of the podcasts, and they've got the director of the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So let's hear the first wee clip, and then you can translate that for us, what's really happening.
Now to the Rachel Reeves conundrum, which is, how do you balance the books? How do you deal with the fiscal black hole? What is your assessment of the scale of what she's going to have to do this autumn?
The blackness of the hole.
The blackness of the hole, yeah, exactly.
I hate the black hole analogy in some ways. I think we don't know yet, and the reason we don't know is because what's going to really matter for Rachel Reeves is, in some sense, not even really what happens in 5 years' time. It's the OBR's assessment of what's going to happen relative to their assessment in March. And actually, even relatively small changes in the kind of expectation for growth in the next 5 years can have pretty big effects. So she had roughly £10 billion of wiggle room against her fiscal rule. She's already given away some of that by not doing the welfare changes, by not doing the winter fuel payments. Interest rates have gone up. That will shave some more off it because higher interest rates mean we spend more on debt interest.
A Bloomberg report last week that suggested there is now a £22 billion black hole by 2029. You don't buy that?
I think it's plausible, but I don't know. It's not just, the OBR haven't decided yet.
Black holes, 22 billion, OBR. How does that fit with your universe?
Well, I feel that you could answer that, Fiona, and so could you, Marlene. Having chatted about it for the last 15 minutes, I think you could make that.
If I was going to answer it, in fact, I was thinking when she was talking, I was thinking, oh, well, that's Rachel Reeves has given herself these fiscal rules. She shouldn't have to have those fiscal rules.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
And this black hole is simply a deficit.
It's a big number on the ledger.
Yeah, and they don't even know what it is because the OBR haven't decided what it is yet.
Yeah. So it's all games, isn't it? I mean, it's all games. Now, they are doing the exact opposite what they need to do if they want to have growth. Now, as I explained earlier on, when you spend money as a government, where does it go? Mostly it goes into the private sector. What creates growth, which we found out after the Second World War, when we had never had it so good, when the government was spending more money. What creates growth? Spending money into the economy. They want to cut the money that they're spending. Do you think that's going to create growth? Well, logically, it doesn't sound to me as if it's going to create growth because you're taking money back out of the economy. How's that going to create growth? You've got it all round the wrong way. If you want to grow the economy, spend more money, employ more teachers, spend a lot of money to make sure that you're combating global warming. Why not spend a lot of money on that?
And yes, that would seem logical given what we've been saying. But you can't have unlimited exponential growth, can you? You cannot.
No, you've got to balance it, obviously. I mean, you're not going to have growth if you butt up against a lack of resources. So as I was saying earlier on, what MMT tells you once you understand all these different variables is that you've now got the capacity to manage what you're doing because you understand a bit more about what's actually happening. When you're blind to what's happening, how can you possibly manage what you're doing? Rachel Reeves does not have a clue what she's doing. We've had how many years? 15 years of austerity, 300,000 people dead, a completely broken economy. And they've been trying to do the same thing the whole time, which is based on that model of, we've got lots of debt, we'll try and cut spending. Has that worked? That's part of my course, actually. I demonstrate it hasn't worked and it's not working. So if something's not working, should you continue doing it? And should these people in that studio be sitting there as if they know how all this works when they don't, clearly? Let's cut more. Oh, she's not getting any money. She's going to have to cut this and she's going to have to cut that. Nobody's turning around in that studio and saying, does the UK government not create the UK pound? The only source of the UK pound? Nobody said that in that programme.
No, they haven't. Yeah. Let's try the next one. And this is from this is the rest is money, it's called. And the guy who's speaking is the former director of the IFS.
Reconcile these two phenomena, as it were. On the one hand, we've got governments saying managing debt and deficit really matters and we've got strict rules. And on the other hand, they've just not worked at all in limiting borrowing and the rise in debt. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that OBR document is really quite concerning. I mean, it refers to our fiscal situation as, quotes, relatively concerning, and shows how our debt, our deficit have risen much faster than nearly all other countries over the last 25 years, and how actually we're paying more interest, a higher rate of interest on our debt than any country in the OECD other than Iceland and New Zealand.
Giving you the starkest counterexample, Germany's national debt has not risen since the financial crisis, or at least not significantly, and they are in a way stronger fiscal position. Now, they've got other problems, industrial problems of a very significant sort, but why is it that Germany has been able to limit the rise in its national debt in a way that we just haven't?
There's quite a lot of things to say there.
On you go.
I'll answer that last question, actually, which is, again, another thing that people don't understand. The way the German economy works is they export lots and they earn a lot of money. So a lot of money comes into the country. which balances up the fact that the government itself might be running a surplus. So money comes in, they take money out as a government, money comes in from the foreign sector. So it's if you were to add them all up, government, private sector, foreign sector, it would all come to zero, right? So there's a thing there which Stephanie Kelton talks about, sectoral balances. I won't say anything about it because you need to learn about it slowly. Yeah. So that's the first thing. That's the reason that Germany is not running such a big deficit or a big debt. There's a technical reason for that. The other thing is, if this thing tells you anything, it tells you that governments cannot run surpluses without destroying the economy. Governments basically always have to run deficits. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of them is that the government spends money into the economy and people save money. And when they save money, they take money out of the economy. So human beings and businesses are savers because they're always worried about things in the future.
The other thing on the on that clip that we saw, which again it just jars now with what we're talking about, is the cost of borrowing. If you can print as much money as you want, why do you need to borrow? Who are you paying the money to, and why?
Again, they're using the wrong word. They are not borrowing. This is another technical thing, which if you look at the mechanics of things, you'll discover that the government does not make any money when they do something called borrowing. Now, what is borrowing? They're just selling some bonds, and people think, oh, they'll get money back in return. But again, in reality, it's all working within reserve accounts of commercial banks, and it's just an exchange of assets. The government does not make any money from borrowing, but they use it to change the exchange rates.
So why do they do it then? Because, they say because of the cost of borrowing got. But if that's a completely unnecessary thing, why do they do it?
Well, it's a good question, Fiona. I mean, and if they understood how things work, you could ask them that question. But if politicians and the general public have got the same idea as most folk on the television talking about it, which is they actually think that they are bringing in money, then you can't ask that question because people don't understand how it works.
Yeah. There was a couple of things sort of popped into my mind on that whole thing about Germany. And you've just said, Germany exports a lot. Germany make things. Germans make things. The UK economy doesn't really make much, does it?
That's right.
And I heard Rachel Reeves the other day sort of saying, oh, we've really got to look after our banking and finance sector because, well, she didn't exactly say that's what the British economy depends on, but it's certainly a big part of it because we don't make that much. Buy something off Amazon, it's probably come from China. So that was one thing. And the other thing that popped into my mind was you saying savers, they take money out of the economy. Yeah, they do. So do billionaires, presumably.
And so do billionaires,
They can't possibly,
cannot
possibly spend it.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
that's another way in which then,
that's right.
people like Elon Musk, and that's another way in which things have changed over the last, say, 50 years, doesn't it?
Yeah, and part of that is a concentration of all activity in London. I don't have the figures in my head or anything like that. But we all know that that's where, in terms of the UK's wealth, it's mostly concentrated down there. And it's mostly concentrated in the finance sector. They're not down in London making so many widgets as part of the UK's economic wealth. They're down there trading money with each other and making wealth that way. So that's part of the problem, of course, is that if the government's concentrating, as they apparently, even the Labour Party are continually concentrating on keeping the wealthy happy, keeping the finance people happy, keeping the banks happy. No, so they're part of the problem. If there are people that don't have jobs because there's no industry, then perhaps the government could have a look at that.
And they also, they don't want to give them any money in benefits, money which they would then spend into the economy.
Exactly.
Because the other billionaires hoarded it in tax havens.
Exactly. And that's another good point, Fiona, because when there's a recession, the money that they give to people as part of the welfare package when they're unemployed is something that brings the economy back up. Because people spend that money. It's called an automatic stabilizer. So to actually stop people getting money, you again are cutting growth by cutting welfare. So again, there's no thought going into this because nobody's attempting to understand it.
Right, let's try another clip, because this is actually really interesting hearing you explain it.
If we're really going to pay for all of this, then you, the electorate, that's you on 40 or 50 or 70,000 pounds, you're going to have to pay for that, rather than pretending that it can all be paid for by these people with 10 million pounds, or these non-doms, or people on over 100,000 pounds, or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's the old one about taxes pay for things, when of course we know that taxes don't pay for things. Taxes have got a use, but just to start with the idea that, have you looked at Stephanie Kelton's book? I mean, the deficit
we
myth.
discovered we've both got Stephanie Kelton's book, but neither of us have got past the first chapter.
Yeah, so she spends whatever it is. How many words are in the book? 500,000 words, explaining all this stuff about how tax revenues do not pay for services or goods, right? So government services. So she spends 500,000 words explaining that. So it's, in some sense, harder for somebody to explain it. Yeah. Without it sounding facile and banal. But basically, the government creates the money. It's not your tax revenues that are used for government spending. All spending is new money, and it only comes into existence when they spend it. That's the mechanics of it. Taxes themselves are not kept. When you pay taxes, are like a debt you have to the government, right? Now, what happens when you pay off a debt? Say, for instance, you've got a debt to the bank, which you then pay down. Have you given the bank money? Is there any money in the bank when you paid it all down? No, it's all disappeared. It's the same kind of idea when you pay your taxes. All you're doing is extinguishing your debt to the government. There's no actual money that they pile up as a result of all the taxes. And
so is it taking money out of circulation then?
Exactly that. And that points to the next reason the government should tax, is to manage inflation. Okay. Now, we spoke about inflation quite a lot in this conversation, because every time I say the government spends money, you both think, what about the inflation? Everybody thinks that. So how do you manage the inflation? Well, you can take money back out of the economy. How do you do that? You tax people.
If you're a person who's concerned about paying taxes, who doesn't like paying taxes, as we know that many people don't, does it matter whether you're taxed first and then you buy services, or services are bought and then you pay tax? You're still paying money out. Does it matter whether it's before or after? Is there any advantage in the fact? I mean, I think this is a huge point in MMT, is that
but I think you're sort of still making that connection between taxing and what's in the economy, whereas what you're saying, Jim, is that the taxing it's got a function, but it's not the function that we think of.
No, it's not the function you think it is.
It's to do with inflation. It's not to do with the money that's in the economy.
Yeah. No taxpayer believes that's why they're paying tax, though. I'd gladly sacrifice a third of my income so that there's less money in the economy.
No, you're right, Fiona, when you say that. Of course you're right. But I was listening to a podcast about 3 or 4 weeks ago when the guy was saying, actually, this is quite a new thing. People not understanding that's how it works. Pre-war, people actually understood more about the role of taxes, and they knew that their taxes weren't spent, were not made, what they were used. They had a better understanding of how it worked. So this is a kind of new idea that everybody believes that their taxes pay for things. There was more of a kind of knowledge of how things worked, how money worked. And he called it monetary blindness or something like that. Is our current way of thinking about it. But one of the things that's interesting, once you start looking at the mechanics of it, the legislation related to taxing and the legislation relating to spending are not in any way connected. They're two entirely different pieces of legislation, not connected in any way. And when the government spends money, a politician at some point says, we need to buy that aeroplane. Okay, the government agrees. They send a message to the Exchequer. The Exchequer says to the central bank, go and spend that money. And the law on that side is they're not allowed not to spend the money. Right? So they've always got to make the spending that the government decides is going to be spent. They don't look in any kind of ledger and say, wait a minute, we don't actually have enough money for that. They're not allowed to do that because that makes no sense anyway. Because the money only comes into existence when it's spent. All spending is new money. Right, so the central bank just says, all right, okay, we need to pay this money out to all these for COVID, make sure all the businesses still exist. So we pay all the money out because the government has told us to do it. But it makes no difference to future spending, and it makes no real difference to whether the government can ever afford anything, because that's all new money at that point of being spent. Taxes have got nothing to do with it.
That's helpful in sort of making that switch in my head. But we've only got 2 wee clips left. This next one is about tax. When we listened to this, Marlene and I thought, oh, that woman in the IFS, she's really good. She knows all this, and she's got this really complicated picture of all these different taxes. And now that I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, it's like deciding what colour of sweets you want in a sweetie shop. Does it matter, where they're from? But let's see if that's what you think.
I think we absolutely should think about how we tax wealth. There's a lot of it. We don't tax it sensibly at the moment. Economists don't really agree, actually, on whether an annual tax on the stock of wealth is a good idea, even in principle. I think where I'd come down on that is that, no, it's not a particularly good idea. At the very least, there are lots of things we should be doing first to fix how we currently tax things, so capital gains, inheritance tax, council tax, before we try and design and implement an entirely new tax with an entirely new tax base, with all the apparatus that goes with that. So, the short answer is, yes, let's think about taxing wealth. I don't think we should be rushing to try and get a new tax.
Where is there a place where the wealth tax is a really effective tool of taxation?
Again, if you're thinking of a tax on the annual stock of wealth, again, I'm saying that because lots of countries have inheritance taxes or capital gains taxes, then Switzerland's always used as the example that has one. It, doesn't raise everything, but it raises a couple of percentage of points of revenue. What stands out about Switzerland, though, is that their other taxes are actually quite low. So they're not taxing incomes and gains at very high rates, and they kind of therefore get away with having a decent-sized wealth taxes. The more common experience across a bunch of European countries is that countries, including Norway as an example, implement these things. They don't go particularly well for various reasons. They don't raise much money, and they get rid of them. So if you think about what's happening with people who've got wealth, they're generating income on that wealth, whether it's just somebody who's investing or someone's got their own business. And we currently tax capital gains at lower rates than other incomes. We don't tax gains on main houses at all. We forgive capital gains at death. But at the same time, despite having those lower rates and those forgivenesses, we also manage to discourage investment because of the way we design the tax base. And without getting into the weeds of that, think of it as we tax inflationary gains. Well, that's a good way to discourage investment if you know that part of the tax will just be because prices are rising in the country. So we managed to get it wrong on both sides in some sense. And I think regardless of whether you want a new tax, taxing the gains people make properly, so fixing the tax base and then increasing the rates, but not just increasing the rates on their own because that would be bad for investment, that would be a good thing to do. But you can do the same thing with council tax. Council tax is regressive. So people who live in more expensive properties pay less as a share of their property value than people who live in lower value properties. That doesn't make any sense.
She made a point at the end there that MMT would agree with, which is, I was saying earlier on, there's reasons for taxing. One of the reasons is inflation earlier on. Another reason is to sort of give the money itself, the UK pound, its value because you've got to use it to pay your taxes. So it validates the currency. Another reason is to be progressive, create greater equality in the country. So by taxing those that are wealthy more than those that are poor, you're actually shifting resources between the two sectors. So the fact that we get free education in Scotland, for example, is in some sense part of that, a progressive approach to taxation. And she mentioned that at the end about council tax. So that is a role of taxation, but most of that entire conversation underlying that with the belief that taxes were paying for government services. But when you take that away, most of it is nonsense. MMT would say, yes, we should tax those that are wealthy for progressive reasons, not for the idea that you only get money in order to pay for things as a government. Because as we know, the UK government, there are, of course, countries like Scotland and many other countries that are currency users, and they do have to tax to get money in.
It's just a big fiction to make it palatable then that you're going to lose some of your money.
I don't know whether the people in government and the economists that are spouting these things completely believe it 100% as to what they're doing. But if they do, it's not a fiction to them. They think that's reality. So this is the thing I said in my course. That one you showed earlier on about me saying they're liars. I thought about that over and over and over again, whether I should leave that in the way that I said it. I eventually thought I'll leave it in because it's got huge impact.
Nobody will pick that and put it on telly. That's what you thought.
Well, I also thought it's a bit unfair. But I eventually fell down the side of leaving it. And one of the reasons I fell down on that side is because it wasn't me that was saying it. It was actually something that was said by another economist. And I was pointing to that, what that economist had said. So I thought, well, it's not really me that's saying it, it's this guy over here.
Yeah.
Plausible deniability. I think that's what you're looking for.
If you want to blame anybody, blame him. I'm just the messenger.
Yeah. It was when you mentioned before the Second World War that you thought that people had a better sense of the role of taxation, and we've lost that now. And I think you said it was monetary blindness. The question that popped into my mind at that point was, well, was that somehow a kind of deliberate move by the the neoliberal economists who wanted to camouflage what people into saying, we want low tax government and you'll have more in your pocket, blah, blah. Yeah. Okay, it's camouflage. That was one thing that popped in my mind. And the other thing is, when we're talking about China, and the Chinese government puts all the money in, they've got, infrastructure. And most of I think you've said a couple of times, most of that money goes to the private sector. It's government spending, it goes into the private sector. So, of course, I have a bit of, well, I don't see why we should be pumping money into the private sector, because they just take huge profits out of it and then they don't look after their assets. Okay, I know that's a whole different argument. But where it got me was, well, okay, that's okay if the private sector then really do fulfill the long-term aims of a government, which, you've said yourself, and we've had them in those early clips, it's about making people's lives better. So I've kind of come back round to, well, I suppose it is all right, actually, to put money into the private sector. Is that kind of a reasonable way of looking at it? Like, you want the government to have long-term aims. Now, it strikes me that sometimes they're stymied because the market often has short-term aims. And they'll come in and say, well, you're not doing that unless you give us a whole load more on it. So, but it's okay if you've got long-term aims and you can put money in to the private sector, non-government sector, and in order to really facilitate those long-term aims, then that's all right, isn't it? That would be a good setup.
Yeah, I mean, all you're talking about there is doing the right thing and managing the economy in a way that gives people a good living, gives them jobs, does the right kind of growth, which is kind of growth that doesn't burn us all up.
Exactly.
Sustainable growth, which I think is what they call the well-being economy. So it's all about management, but you can't manage something if you don't really understand how it works, which is what most neoliberal economics doesn't understand, how the monetary system works, and in some sense how the economy works. I think you're butting up against one thing here, which is that some things are best left in the private sector and some things are better done by government.
Okay,
so for example, should the private sector be running your water and your electricity and all the main things that every country needs? How well are they doing it down south?
Absolutely. I think it comes back to this sort of right at the beginning saying, you hear these bold statements, just print more money. And actually, there's all sorts of reasons why it's not as simple as that. And I think what you've just said there is all valid stuff. But that is not the bit of the story that you hear when you've got somebody just saying, no, just print more money.
It's very difficult to talk about MMT because people fixate on the one thing. Yeah. And then you can't clarify, because by the time they've stopped talking, the only thing people remember you said was the government creates the money. You've not got enough time and space to say, well, there's lots of variables going on here. It's very complicated. And, it's all about resources. I mean, MMT says it's all about resources and real, but you don't get that far because people jump in.
I think that's fair enough. And actually, I started listening to the course, going back to what this is all why we're talking to you. I haven't got very far through it, but that was one of the things I immediately picked up on and went, if I'd heard the thing about if you've got the resources, then I didn't remember for exactly what you've just said, because what I remember is you just print more money, blah, blah, blah. And then we all get into the Weimar Republic and Rhodesia and collapse. And that was something that stuck in my mind. So if I've got a bit more time, I'm going to do two things. Jim, I'm going to actually read Stephanie Kelton's book because it's on my Kindle and I've never got really past the first or second chapter, and then go back in and maybe use that to see what you were saying. Is there a particular advantage that you've kind of thought through that it would help a newly independent Scotland? That would be one question.
Yeah.
And my other question is, because I know a few people and they're completely MMT enthusiasts, but I wouldn't say they're terribly well informed. Mm-hmm. And they want to go out and knock on doors and start telling people about MMT. And I go, Paul, this is not a campaigning tool. You're never going to knock on a door, tell someone that the government can process the money. I mean, it's going to go nowhere. But I do wonder if there's another question about how it might help.
You know, Eva Bolander, she invited me. She's part of a particular branch. And I had a chat with her before. And she says, look, what will you do, Jim? Don't give them the government spends money story, because everybody will just instantly shut down. You'll have to find another strategy. So the strategy I came up with was to talk about sovereignty and the different aspects of sovereignty. And actually, it was a really good session we had. People were all nodding and they all get into the idea about what it was about, because sovereignty is about power. It's about power over the monetary system. It's about power over your energy system. It's about power over your food system. So it's all these things that you have control over or don't have control over. So if you've not got control over your food, which is what I talk about on the course, you could say, oh, Scotland is rich in energy, renewable energy. Scotland is rich in food. Scotland is rich in this, that, and the next thing. But does the government have control over these things? Largely no.
Would it have control if we were independent?
There's absolutely no reason why it could not be. If you remember the start of the National Health Service, what we had was private health, and people in poverty, obviously, they couldn't afford it. Lots of people dying. What happened when the NHS started is the government bought over all these things. Obviously, I'm sure they gave them money for it. But when you're in government, you've got control over your own territory in that sense.
Yeah.
You can take over whatever you need to take over to start up a National Health Service. You can take over, or at least have some way of influencing the people that run our food industry for the benefit of the citizens of Scotland. Energy, for example, is one of the most important things for any country to have control over. And as you know, right now in Scotland, we have no control over it. Our neighbours have control over it. And we have the highest energy bills in Europe. It's awful. Yeah. We do not have control over it. So it's about sovereignty. So that's one way of addressing it. So if you've got sovereignty over the monetary system, you're no longer a currency user, you're a currency issuer. Now, you can say that and people won't bat an eyelid because you've not said, we make and spend the money, but they've got kind of says, all right, I see what you mean. Nobody batted an eyelid, right? and they control the monetary system. Nobody batted an eyelid. So it's all about control. So that's the way I did it. And for some reason, people started to say, all right, okay, I can see how that works.
Yes, I think that's quite a good way of...
I think that's really good. I think that's excellent because, sovereignty is a word that is used, genuinely used as a lot within the indie circles.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's always with respect to constitutional things.
Yeah, that's right.
And Scots, and fair enough, because, that's the underlying fault that's there. But I think to expand that out to as you've been saying, you did it at least at that meeting and how you think about it, that's a really good move to make.
Well, I started it exactly the same way you're describing there. I says most people will understand sovereignty in this way, the way you described it there. But sovereignty is just about power over different things. You can have personal sovereignty, power over your own body to do whatever you like with it. You can have financial, all of these different things. You can use the word sovereignty. And it's control over it, it's power over it.
That's a really good way, because talking about that, I don't feel that sort of hackles rising.
No, that's right. That's right.
You get the kind of, just print your own money thing.
Yeah.
The thing about MMT is it's easy to caricature everything in MMT. Even I find it difficult not to say things which sound facile. I like writing about it, and I can write in more detail. But when it comes to talking about it, you summarise things so much that you can lose the subtlety of it. And I definitely do that, you know.
And I think you're right that once somebody's shutter comes down because they've heard something, then they can't hear anything else that you say. So it is so important.
Yeah.
We did have one more clip.
These massive long-term liabilities, whether it is the cost of an aging population, which means that costs for the health service are rising exponentially, whether it is the cost to the public purse of the so-called triple lock. And then if you go decades out, the cost of maintaining living standards for older people relative to a shrinking workforce get even bigger.
Well, I think that's why we need to take responsibility with the fiscal numbers really seriously, because we focus every budget, every year, is the Chancellor going to meet her fiscal rules or whatever over the next 4 or 5 years? And you always get these calls from people saying, well, actually, it doesn't matter so much, maybe we should loosen them. But everything gets harder, I'm afraid, as we go further through the next couple or 3 or 4 decades. The Prime Minister, just a month or so ago, promised another nearly £40 billion a year on defence. Now, that's completely unfunded. Add that to the cost of health, add that to the cost of pensions, add that to the cost of climate change policies and so on. And we are looking at another really big increase in tax, presumably, over this period to pay for all of this.
I could point them to this. I put that up on the screen and say, oh, look at all those deficits. Did that have any effect on future spending? No. And that's real data from history in the UK. And secondly, I would point them to Stephanie Kelton's book, in the second half of the book, where she talks about, it's not about financial deficits, it's about real deficits. It's about poverty, pensioners' poverty. It's about, people not having work. It's about people not having rich lives where they can make the best of themselves. These are the deficits that we should be worried about, not about financial deficits, which history shows us do not matter a jot for certain countries that make their own currency. So that would be what I would say in reply to that. He's talking nonsense, and history is on my side.
So that is the prevailing narrative, though. That's what you hear on. We just happen to have chosen a podcast. You could pick up any newspaper. You could listen to anything on any mainstream media. That's what they believe. And this is frustration, I think, is first of all getting over the bits you have trouble with MMT and not getting stuck in some of those concepts. But then once you do beyond that, you find yourself in a world where nobody else believes it.
I think it's a deliberate campaign to muddy the water and all of this stuff. So there absolutely is. If you read George Monbiot, he talks about the rise of neoliberalism and about the control of the media and the control of the agenda of the media. And this is all part of it.
What Stephanie Kelton then has done, when you were saying that, she says, look, you have to think about the deficit that matters.
Yeah.
And then there's those deficits about, richness of life, education, all of those. That's another really good way of expanding what deficit is taken to mean, in the way that you did earlier with sovereignty. And it just makes it, if you say to someone, well, do you want to do something about the deficit that means that X percentage of pensioners are in poverty? Or do you want to do something about, people not going job? Let's do something about those deficits. Actually, and certainly in Scotland, but to be honest, I think in the UK as a whole, you would get a positive response to that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is what's been good about this conversation, actually, because it draws out these things. They're all in my head and they're all in your head, but when you talk about them, at least we're kind of airing them, and it puts them in, hopefully people, they can then talk about it and say, all right, I can see that would be one way of thinking about it. It wouldn't have been what I would have thought about naturally necessarily, but because we're talking about it, it comes out.
I do feel that it's sorted some bits out in my head, so thank you for that, at least.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I've just really appreciated the whole chat, and I feel I've gained from it, because I don't feel the same, like a bit what you were saying there, Fiona. I don't sort of feel I've still got the but kind of response which I did beforehand. So that's a step in the right direction, and I'll just get into my Kindle later on and get past chapter 2.
Deficit Myths, a great book, well worth reading.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed the chat. I think it's helpful as well because, like if we're chatting away about it and then you put those clips in, I feel as if you're looking at that differently now. You're thinking,
Yes.
and that's part of what can make something like this successful, because the audience is doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
They're
It's
looking
like
at
the Wizard of Oz, where you take the curtain away and you're going, hang on.
That's right. It's like, wait a minute. Surely that's not true. Jim Byrne just said. And Fiona and Marlene agreed.
We think.
And they're very smart people.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.